You know, there's something deeply unsettling about the phrase, "we keep it, I guess." It's the kind of casual uncertainty you'd expect from someone who just found a $20 bill in their old coat pocket, not from a sitting president discussing the seizure of an oil tanker. But here we are in December 2025, and that's exactly what happened when Donald Trump was asked what the United States planned to do with the Venezuelan crude oil they'd just seized from a tanker off the Venezuelan coast. "We keep it, I guess," he said, with all the gravitas of a man trying to remember if he left his garage door open. And look, I get it. If you're going to seize an oil tanker, you probably want to sound like you have some sort of plan for what comes next. Maybe something along the lines of, "This oil will be sold and the proceeds will go to anti-drug trafficking efforts," or "We'll use this as evidence in our ongoing investigation." But instead, Trump gave us the energy of a child who just caught a fish and has absolutely no idea what to do with it. "Well, we keep it, I guess. Do we need a bigger aquarium? Is this thing going to fit in the refrigerator?" Now, if you haven't been following this story, and frankly I don't blame you because there's been a lot going on, the United States recently seized a Venezuelan oil tanker called the Skipper in what officials described as a law enforcement operation targeting drug trafficking. The Coast Guard, supported by Navy forces, rappelled from helicopters onto the ship in international waters, executing what they called a seizure warrant. And if you're thinking that sounds like something out of a Jason Statham movie, you're not wrong. The only difference is that Jason Statham would have at least had a clear plan for what to do with the oil. Now, you might be wondering, as I certainly was, what exactly gives the United States the legal authority to seize foreign-flagged vessels in international waters? And the answer, according to the Trump administration, is, well, they haven't been entirely clear on that point. They've mentioned something about sanctions enforcement and drug trafficking, but when you dig into the actual legal framework, things get murky pretty quickly. It's like asking someone to explain the plot of a Christopher Nolan movie after they've only seen the trailer. You get the general idea that there are boats and explosions and maybe some time travel, but the details don't quite add up. But here's where things get really interesting, and by interesting I mean deeply concerning. This tanker seizure is happening against the backdrop of what the Trump administration calls its war on drug trafficking, which has involved conducting military strikes on boats in the Caribbean that they claim are carrying drugs from Venezuela. And I say claim because, according to reports, the intelligence for determining whether these boats are actually carrying drugs bound for the United States has been, shall we say, somewhat questionable. In fact, one of the boats they struck was reportedly heading south away from the United States at the time it was attacked. Which raises the obvious question, if you're trying to stop drugs from reaching American shores, why are you blowing up boats that are sailing in the opposite direction? It's like trying to prevent someone from breaking into your house by shooting at people walking away from your neighborhood. It's not just ineffective, it's completely backwards. And this brings us to what might be the most disturbing aspect of this entire operation, the so-called double tap strikes. Now, if you're not familiar with military terminology, a double tap strike is when you hit a target and then you hit it again to make sure it's destroyed. In this case, according to multiple reports, after the initial strike on a Venezuelan boat in September, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth allegedly gave a verbal order to leave no survivors, leading to a second strike that killed 2 men who had survived the first attack and were clinging to the wreckage. Let me just pause here for a moment, because this is important. If these reports are accurate, we're talking about the deliberate killing of shipwreck survivors. That's not drug interdiction. That's not law enforcement. That's not even close to being within the bounds of international law. That's something you'd expect to read about in a historical account of naval warfare from the 1800s, not in a news report from 2025. And yet, when Congress has demanded to see the full, unedited video of these strikes, the Pentagon has been remarkably reluctant to comply. In fact, lawmakers have been so frustrated with the lack of transparency that they've inserted a provision into the Defense Authorization Bill that would withhold a quarter of Pete Hegseth's travel budget unless he releases the footage. Think about that for a moment. Congress is essentially saying, if you don't show us what happened, you can't fly to as many conferences. It's like grounding a teenager, except the teenager has access to military drones and the power to order strikes in international waters. Now, Defense Secretary Hegseth has defended these operations, saying they have the absolute and complete authority to conduct them. But when pressed for the legal basis for this authority, his explanation was essentially because drugs are bad and we need to protect Americans, which, while true in principle, is not actually a legal justification for conducting military strikes in international waters without congressional authorization. It's like saying you have the right to break into someone's garage because you think they might be planning to egg your house. The logic doesn't quite hold up under scrutiny. Meanwhile, Venezuela has condemned the tanker seizure as an act of international piracy, which, you know what, fair point. Because when you think about it, seizing a ship on the high seas and keeping its cargo does sound remarkably similar to the definition of piracy. The only difference is that pirates usually have more clearly defined goals and better coordinated plans. At least when Blackbeard seized a ship, he knew exactly what he was going to do with the treasure. Trump's approach is more like, we took the thing, now what? Oh, well, we keep it, I guess. And it's not just Venezuela expressing concern. Cuba's foreign minister called the seizure an aggressive escalation, which is particularly notable given that Cuba was apparently the tanker's intended destination. So now we have a situation where the United States has essentially intercepted someone else's mail and decided to keep it. It's like your postal worker deciding they like the look of a package addressed to your neighbor and just taking it home instead. Sure, they might claim it was for a good reason, but that doesn't make it any less weird or potentially illegal. But perhaps the most absurd aspect of this entire situation is the reasoning behind it. According to Attorney General Pam Bondi, this tanker was seized because it had been sanctioned by the United States for multiple years due to its involvement in an illicit oil shipping network supporting foreign terrorist organizations. So, let me get this straight. We've known about this ship for years. We've known it was violating sanctions. We've known it was potentially supporting terrorist organizations. And our response was to wait until it was carrying a full load of oil and then seize it in a dramatic helicopter raid. It's like knowing someone has been stealing packages from your front porch for months, watching them take one more package and then tackling them in the street while yelling, "Surprise, you're under citizen's arrest!" Why not just, I don't know, arrest them the first time or the second time or literally any time before they're in the middle of committing the crime you've been watching them commit for years? And here's where things get even more confusing. The Trump administration has been positioning these operations as part of their fight against drug trafficking and their pressure campaign against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. But if you're trying to pressure Maduro, wouldn't it make more sense to prevent Venezuelan oil from reaching international markets rather than taking it and keeping it for yourself? Because right now, it looks less like economic pressure and more like the United States has decided to become a competitor in the Venezuelan oil business. It's like trying to shut down your neighbor's lemonade stand by buying all their lemons and then setting up your own lemonade stand right next to theirs. You're not actually stopping the lemonade trade, you're just getting into the lemonade business with extra steps and significantly more helicopters. But the Trump administration insists this is all about protecting Americans from drug trafficking, which brings us back to those boat strikes I mentioned earlier, because if you look at the numbers, the results are pretty staggering. According to reports, the US military has killed 87 people in strikes that have destroyed 23 alleged drug boats. Now, I'm not a military strategist, but that averages out to nearly 4 deaths per boat, which seems like a remarkably high casualty rate for what are supposedly drug interdiction operations. And here's what's particularly concerning about these numbers. We have no idea whether any of these operations actually prevented drugs from reaching the United States. Think about that for a moment. We've killed nearly 90 people, deployed aircraft carriers, and seized oil tankers, all in the name of stopping drug trafficking. But has anyone bothered to measure whether drug availability or prices have changed in American cities as a result? It's like declaring war on jaywalking and then never checking whether fewer people are actually jaywalking. You're just assuming that shooting at crosswalks must be working because you're making a lot of noise and spending a lot of money. And speaking of spending money, let's talk about the cost of all this. The USS Gerald R. Ford, which launched those helicopters for the tanker seizure, costs approximately $13 billion to build and runs about $4.7 billion per year to operate. That's just one ship. Add in the cost of the other warships, the aircraft, the personnel, and the fuel for all these operations, and you're looking at billions of dollars being spent to apparently collect oil tankers and sink fishing boats. It's like hiring a team of neurosurgeons to swat flies. Sure, they'll probably get the job done, but you have to wonder if there might be a more cost-effective approach. And here's the thing that really bothers me about all of this. Congress is having to literally threaten to withhold travel money to get basic information about what our military is doing in our name. Think about how backwards that is. We live in a democracy where the people's elected representatives are supposed to have oversight over military operations. But instead, we have lawmakers essentially saying, if you don't tell us how you killed those people, you'll have to take fewer business trips. It's like trying to discipline a child by taking away their video games, except the child has nuclear weapons and the ability to start international incidents. The scale of the punishment doesn't quite match the scale of the problem. And meanwhile, Defense Secretary Hegseth is out there giving interviews where he says things like, we've got operators out there doing this right now, so whatever we were to decide to release, we'd have to be very responsible about it. which sounds reasonable until you realize that he's talking about being responsible while discussing operations that may have involved the deliberate killing of shipwreck survivors. It's like an arsonist talking about fire safety. Sure, responsibility is important, but maybe we should start with not setting things on fire in the first place. Now, I should mention that some Republicans in Congress have defended these operations. Senator Mark Wayne Mullin said, if it was a boat still operative, were they still trying to run? We don't know what the circumstances are at all. Which is a perfectly reasonable question, except that we do know some of the circumstances. We know that survivors were clinging to wreckage when they were allegedly targeted in a second strike. We know that at least one of the boats was heading away from the United States when it was attacked. We know that the intelligence for determining whether these boats were actually carrying drugs to America has been questioned by lawmakers from both parties. In other words, we know enough to be very concerned about what we don't know. And when your response to "we might have committed war crimes" is, well, we don't know all the facts, that's usually a sign that you should probably find out what the facts are before defending the actions. But here's what's even more troubling. According to reports, some of the intelligence used to justify these strikes has been questionable at best. Lawmakers have learned that at least one of the boats was heading towards Suriname, not the United States, when it was attacked. Another was reportedly turning back when it was hit. So we're essentially conducting military strikes based on the assumption that boats in the Caribbean must be carrying drugs to America, even when they're sailing in the wrong direction. It's like assuming every car on the highway is planning to rob your house, even the ones driving away from your neighborhood. The logic is so fundamentally flawed that it would be funny if people weren't dying because of it. But here's what's really troubling about this whole situation. The casual way in which the Trump administration has escalated military actions in the Caribbean without any clear legal authorization or strategic objective. They've moved aircraft carriers, deployed thousands of troops, conducted airstrikes, and now seized an oil tanker, all under the banner of fighting drug trafficking. But if you look at the actual results, it's hard to see how any of this has made Americans safer from drugs. Instead, what we have is a series of increasingly aggressive military actions that seem designed more to look tough than to actually solve problems. It's like trying to fix a leaky pipe by hitting it with a sledgehammer. Sure, it's dramatic and it might make you feel like you're taking decisive action, but you're probably just going to make the problem worse. And that brings us back to that oil tanker and Trump's casual admission that he doesn't really know what to do with it, because that moment of uncertainty captures something important about this entire operation. The Trump administration seems to have seized this tanker not because they had a clear plan for how it would advance American interests, but because seizing things looks decisive and tough. It's the foreign policy equivalent of a toddler grabbing a toy from another child. The toddler doesn't necessarily want to play with the toy, they just want to have it because taking things feels powerful. And when you ask them what they're going to do with it, they look at you with the same confused expression Trump had when he said, "We keep it, I guess." But here's the problem with conducting foreign policy like a toddler with a toy. Other countries notice. Venezuela has already called this an act of piracy. Other Latin American countries are watching to see if they might be next. Our allies are wondering whether we've completely abandoned any pretense of following international law, and our adversaries are taking notes on how to justify their own aggressive actions in international waters. Because if the United States can seize an oil tanker in international waters based on allegations of sanctions violations, what's to stop China from seizing American ships based on their own interpretation of international law? What's to stop Russia from intercepting vessels they claim are carrying weapons to Ukraine? What's to stop any country with a navy from deciding that they have the right to seize ships they don't like? The problem is that we're essentially playing a game where we're making up the rules as we go along, but other players get to use those same made-up rules against us later. It's like cheating at Monopoly by declaring that you can take money directly from the bank whenever you want, and then being surprised when everyone else starts doing the same thing. Sure, it works great when you're the only one doing it, but it tends to fall apart pretty quickly when everyone adopts your creative interpretation of the rules. And this isn't just about naval law or international relations theory. This is about American credibility on the world stage. For decades, the United States has positioned itself as a defender of international law and maritime freedom. We've condemned other countries for exactly the kind of behavior we're now engaging in. When China builds artificial islands in the South China Sea and claims territorial waters around them, we call it illegal. When Iran threatens to block shipping lanes, we call it an act of aggression. When Russia seizes Ukrainian ships, we impose sanctions. But now we're out here rappelling onto tankers and keeping the oil, and our justification is essentially, trust us, we're the good guys. In other words, the precedent we're setting here is potentially far more dangerous than any immediate benefit we might gain from keeping this particular oil tanker. We're essentially saying that might makes right on the high seas, which is a principle that tends to favor countries with bigger navies and looser interpretations of international law. And all of this is happening while Congress is literally having to threaten budget cuts to get basic information about what our military is doing. Think about how insane that is. We have lawmakers saying, we'll take away your travel money unless you tell us whether you committed war crimes. And the response from the Pentagon is, we're still thinking about it. But perhaps what's most concerning is how normalized this has become. We're talking about military operations that would have been front-page scandals just a few years ago, and now they barely register in the news cycle. It's like we've collectively decided that as long as you slap the label anti-drug operation on something, you can pretty much do whatever you want in international waters. Want to sink boats with survivors still aboard? Anti-drug operation. Want to seize oil tankers? Anti-drug operation. Want to deploy aircraft carriers to intimidate a sovereign nation? Anti-drug operation. It's become the national security of maritime law, a phrase that justifies everything and explains nothing. It's like your babysitter refusing to tell you what happened while you were out, and when you threaten to dock their pay, they say, well, I'm still deciding whether that information is classified. That's not how accountability is supposed to work in a democracy. So where does this leave us? Well, we have an administration that has seized an oil tanker without a clear plan for what to do with it, conducted military strikes of questionable legality, refused to provide transparency to Congress, and established precedents that could come back to haunt us when other countries decide to follow our example. And through it all, the most honest moment might have been when Trump admitted he doesn't really know what the plan is. Because at least that was truthful. At least that acknowledged the reality that this administration seems to be making up foreign policy as they go along, seizing ships and conducting strikes not because they have a coherent strategy, but because it looks tough and decisive. The problem is that looking tough and being effective are not the same thing. And when you're conducting military operations with real consequences for real people, the difference between those two things can literally be a matter of life and death. So maybe, just maybe, before we seize any more oil tankers or conduct any more airstrikes, we should figure out what our actual goals are and whether our actions are helping us achieve them. Because we keep it, I guess, is not a foreign policy strategy. It's what you say when you've acted without thinking, and now you're trying to figure out what you've gotten yourself into. And that's not the kind of uncertainty you want from the world's most powerful military when they're conducting operations in international waters. That's the kind of uncertainty that turns minor diplomatic incidents into major international crises. But hey, at least we got some oil out of it, we think. Probably. We keep it, I guess.